Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. Late Night with the Devil. It was just another late-night broadcast, or so everyone thought. The dark void of the evening swallowed the small town of Ridgeway, as the sky was blanketed in thick clouds, only faintly pierced by the light of a distant moon. A low hum of traffic buzzed in the distance, but most of the town's residents were tucked safely in their homes, their televisions glowing softly as the late-night shows ran. Yet, for one station, this late-night broadcast was different. The show was called Midnight Hour, a local news and mystery program that aired every Friday at midnight. Hosted by the charismatic but eccentric Donnie Kane, the show had gained a small but devoted following. The program was infamous for its obscure segments, dark tales, and chilling reports, often leaving the viewers with more questions than answers. Donnie, with his cryptic smile and dramatic flair, was known to spin stories that blurred the line between fiction and reality. That night, however, something felt off. The station's director, Sarah, had grown used to the odd requests that came in from Donnie. But tonight, the request was different. "Sarah, I've got something for the show." Something big, Donnie had said when he called earlier that evening. His voice sounded uncharacteristically cold, and his usual tone of playfulness was absent. "It's going to change everything." Sarah had seen Donnie's antics before, his strange, sometimes dark sense of humor, his obsession with the paranormal, and the way he delighted in leaving the audience unnerved. But this time, she didn't sense excitement in his voice. She heard something else, fear. The plan was simple. Donnie would interview an alleged former cult member who claimed to have witnessed something far darker than anyone could imagine. She didn't think much of it. They had done similar stories in the past. But this one felt different. The person they were interviewing, a man named Nathaniel Grant, had been elusive for months, and rumors swirled that his story would shake Ridgeway to its very core. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah's unease grew. She looked over at the producer, Jack, who seemed equally on edge. The cameras were set. The crew was prepared. And the only thing left was the story. Donnie had arrived early, but there was a coldness to him that wasn't part of his usual showmanship. He sat quietly in his dressing room, staring at the script, his fingers tapping restlessly on the desk. Sarah knocked on the door to check on him, but Donnie didn't respond. She turned the knob and stepped inside. "Donnie?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He looked up from the script, his eyes hollow and dark, his usual confident grin nowhere to be found. "Tonight's show is more than just a story, Sarah. I've seen things. Things that..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Donnie, we're live in 20 minutes, she said, trying to push past the odd tension. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I know," he said sharply. "But tonight, I'm not just telling a story. I'm warning people. I'm begging them to listen." The lights flickered as Sarah exited the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but she had a job to do. At midnight, the show began. The cameras rolled, and Donnie's usual charming smile lit up the screen. "Good evening, Ridgeway, and welcome to Midnight Hour. Tonight, we're diving into something darker than usual. Something that will make you question what's real and what's not. But first, let's meet my guest. The camera panned to Nathaniel Grant, a gaunt figure in his late 30s, his eyes wide and restless, his hands trembling in his lap. His clothes were tattered, and his hair was unkempt. He didn't look like the typical interviewee Donnie would invite on the show. He looked haunted. "Thank you for joining us, Nathaniel," Donnie said, leaning forward. "I understand that you've been through some things. Some things that most people would never believe." Nathaniel's voice cracked as he spoke, his words barely audible. I didn't want to tell anyone. But now I have no choice." The screen flickered for a brief moment. A shadow moved in the background, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make Sarah's heart race. She watched the monitor closely, her mind racing. "Go ahead," Donnie prompted. "Tell us what you've seen, what you've experienced." Nathaniel looked into the camera, his eyes filled with terror. The cult, they didn't just worship demons. They made deals. Deals with something darker. Something that doesn't belong in this world. His voice dropped to a whisper. And they let it in. At that moment, the lights flickered again. And the power went out. For a split second, everything went dark. The cameras went black, the station went silent. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't part of the script. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the lights returned, but something was wrong. The studio looked different. The air felt heavier. The crew exchanged confused looks. The clock read 12:03 a.m. And that's when it began. Part 2, The Unseen Guest. As the lights flickered back to life, Sarah could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The studio felt different, colder somehow. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the room, not from the cameras or the equipment, but from something deeper. Something unnatural. The crew looked around in confusion, trying to make sense of the technical glitch. Jack, the producer, frantically checked the control panel, his face pale. This isn't possible. The equipment's fine. Everything's running. Donnie, however, remained calm, almost too calm. He smiled as he faced the camera again, but his eyes had changed. They were darker now, more hollow, as if the very soul behind them had been replaced by something else. "Sorry for the interruption, folks," Donnie said smoothly, his voice laced with a strange, eerie quality. "Technical difficulties. Happens to the best of us. But don't worry. We're back." He turned to Nathaniel, whose face had gone even paler in the few seconds the lights were out. The man trembled, his eyes darting nervously around the set. "Donnie, something's not right," Nathaniel whispered, his voice shaky. I don't feel safe here. It's too late. It's too late for all of us." But Donnie only laughed, a low, rumbling sound that didn't quite match the usual warmth of his demeanor. "Don't worry, Nathaniel. You're in the right place. This is the only place where your story matters. Where the truth can be told." Nathaniel's expression grew more frantic. "No! You don't understand. The cult, there's something here. It followed me. It knows what I did." At that moment, Sarah noticed something strange. In the reflection of the studio's glass windows, there was a shadow. A shape. It was distorted, moving slowly, and it seemed to be growing taller as if it were stepping closer. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the empty, silent room behind them. The hairs on Sarah's arms stood on end. She glanced at Jack, but he was too busy trying to fix the technical issues. The sound equipment was glitching again, a high-pitched squeal screeching through the air for a moment before it died down. Donnie's eyes flickered to Nathaniel, then to the camera, and his smile widened. "Tell us, Nathaniel. Tell us everything. Everything you've seen. Everything you've done. Your secrets are safe with us." His tone, usually so smooth and reassuring, now carried an edge that made Sarah's stomach churn. Nathaniel recoiled, gripping the edge of the chair as though trying to hold himself together. I can't. It's too dangerous." His voice rose in panic, but Donnie merely laughed again, a sound that filled the studio with an oppressive weight. "Too dangerous?" Donnie said, his smile never wavering. "Nathaniel, you're safe here. You're home." There was something in his eyes now, something cold, malevolent. "Tell us, or you'll never leave." The air grew colder still. Sarah could see her breath fogging in front of her as she stared at the monitor. The temperature in the room had plummeted, and she could feel the icy fingers of fear wrapping around her heart. She turned back to Nathaniel, who now looked like a man cornered, desperate to escape something that was closing in on him. But there was nowhere to go. They were all trapped. Suddenly, Nathaniel's face twisted in pain. He clutched at his chest, gasping for air. It's here. It's coming for me." His voice was raw with terror. Sarah stepped forward, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. But before she could make a decision, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just flicker, they went out completely. For a moment, everything was plunged into absolute darkness. And then, there was a sound. A low, guttural growl, so deep and resonant it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was followed by a whisper, barely audible, but undeniably there. The whisper was in a language that none of them recognized, a language that seemed to scrape at the edges of reality itself. Donnie's voice cut through the darkness, but it wasn't the same. His words were now distorted, like a warped recording. "Nathaniel. It's time." The studio lights flickered back to life, but this time, something was different. Nathaniel was no longer in his seat. He had vanished, completely. The chair he had been sitting in was empty, but the shadows in the room had grown longer, more pronounced, as though something were lurking just out of view. "Where is he?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising in panic. She looked at Jack, but he was staring at the monitors, his face ashen. "He was here. He was just here." Donnie's grin had turned into a wide, unsettling sneer. "He's with them now. Just like I said he would be." Sarah's mind was racing. "With who? What the hell is going on, Donnie?" Donnie stood, his movements jerky, as though not entirely his own. "It's simple, Sarah," he said, his voice now completely unnatural. "You wanted the truth, and now you've got it. But some truths are better left undiscovered." Before she could respond, the camera feed went black again. This time, it didn't flicker back. The entire station was silent. Part 3, the final hour. The silence in the studio was suffocating. Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The monitors were completely black now, as if they had been swallowed by the void. The only sound left was the distant hum of the station's air conditioning. Everything else was still. "What? What just happened?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She felt the cold against her skin, biting through her jacket, and a sinking sensation in her stomach, as if something unseen was pressing down on her, keeping her in place. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. Jack, still staring at the dead monitors, muttered under his breath, "It can't be. There's no way." Sarah looked toward him, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Where's Donnie? Where's Nathaniel?" He didn't answer right away, his face pale and drawn, his eyes distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was all supposed to be fake. Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, fake? You're telling me this was staged?" Jack's hand trembled as he reached for the control panel again, as though trying to bring the show back. But nothing happened. The lights remained dim, the cameras were still, and the only sound in the room was the eerie, low hum. "I don't know," Jack said finally, his voice tight with panic. "I thought it was just a gimmick, you know? A bit of supernatural horror for the ratings. But now it feels real. Too real." Before Sarah could respond, the room plunged into darkness again. The hum grew louder, vibrating the walls, and a deep, guttural sound rumbled from somewhere deep within the station itself. Something was moving through the building, something vast and ancient. Something that shouldn't be in Ridgeway. Then, a whisper. A voice, so close it felt like it was breathing in her ear. "Help him." The voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping across the ground. Sarah froze. She turned toward Jack, but he wasn't there. His chair was empty, his presence gone. She glanced around, frantic, but there was no sign of him. The whispering continued, louder now, echoing in the dark. "Help him. He's trapped." The room seemed to pulse, each beat of the invisible entity causing the very air to crackle with tension. Then, the lights flickered back on. And Donnie was there. He was standing in the center of the studio, his face contorted in a grotesque mask of pain and something darker. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his body stiff as if it had been frozen in place. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, slowly, the voice that emerged was not his own. "It's too late." The voice was low and deep, like the sound of something rising from the depths of hell itself. It was not human. And it was not Donnie. His body began to jerk unnaturally, as if something inside him was trying to escape. His skin rippled, a shadow twisting beneath it, making his outline blur and shift. Then, with a horrible crack, his neck snapped, but his head stayed still, facing the camera, his mouth stretching into a grotesque, impossible smile. Sarah staggered back, her pulse racing. She was frozen with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. Her body felt as though it had been turned to stone. "Help me," came a voice again. But this time, it wasn't from the shadowy figure of Donnie. It was from Nathaniel. She turned, and there he was. Standing in the corner of the room, pale and trembling, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something wrong about him, something unnatural. His movements were jerky, his body too stiff, as if he were a puppet on strings. "Nathaniel," Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper. He raised a hand, shaking, and pointed at Donnie. "He's not him anymore," Nathaniel croaked. "It's not just a show. It's real. It's real, and it's coming for us." The lights flickered again, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She was no longer in the studio. She was in a place between worlds, where the shadows were thick and suffocating, where the air smelled like decay. And in that place, she saw it. It was a figure, towering and monstrous, with eyes that gleamed like burning embers. Its skin was a swirling mass of darkness, as though the very concept of night itself had taken shape. Its claws stretched out, each finger an impossibly long, twisted thing, its smile wide and malevolent. The figure's voice thundered in Sarah's mind, a scream that didn't need sound to be heard. "It's too late, Sarah. You cannot escape what you've awakened." Her breath caught in her throat as the figure began to step closer, the very air warping around it. Nathaniel screamed, but his voice was lost to the shifting darkness. And then, just as quickly, it was over. The studio snapped back into place. The lights were on. The cameras were running. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Donnie was gone. Nathaniel was gone. And the station was silent once more. But something was different. There was a new presence in the room, lingering just out of sight, like a shadow cast from the very depths of hell. It watched, waited, and it smiled. Part 4, The Unraveling. Sarah stumbled back as the oppressive silence enveloped her. Her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Donnie was gone. Nathaniel was gone. And the studio, now silent and unremarkable, felt like a distant memory of what it had been moments before. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake from a nightmare, but there was no escape. The air was thick with an energy she couldn't explain, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling as if she were being watched. She turned to Jack, but the producer was nowhere to be found. She called out his name, but her voice felt muffled, swallowed by the stillness of the room. "This isn't real," she thought desperately. "This can't be happening. This is a dream. This has to be a dream." But deep down, she knew the truth. Something was very wrong. As she walked toward the empty chairs where Donnie and Nathaniel had once sat, she noticed the faintest shimmer in the air, like a distortion, a ripple, a glimpse of something else behind the veil of the studio's reality. The air smelled of mildew and something far worse, something rotting, like death was seeping into the very foundation of the building. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the phone on the desk, hoping to call for help, to call anyone. But as she pressed the buttons, she realized the screen was blank. There was no signal. No connection to the outside world. "Donnie? Jack?" she whispered into the room, her voice barely audible over the deep, hollow feeling that was settling in her chest. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The reflection in the glass. Not her own. Not anyone she recognized. But something dark, something that shouldn't be there. It was watching her, standing just behind her, too tall, too dark, with eyes that gleamed like the blackest pits. She spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing but the hum of the air conditioning and the buzzing of the lights overhead. "It's not real," she told herself again. "It's not real. It's just the lights messing with my head." But the sense of unease refused to leave her, the cold grip of dread tightening with every passing second. Suddenly, the studio door swung open. Sarah froze. Sarah, a voice called, but it wasn't Jack. It wasn't anyone familiar. The voice was distorted, twisted, like it was trying to speak through a wall of static. "You've been waiting, haven't you?" She turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Donnie, at least, it looked like Donnie. His clothes were torn, his face pale and drawn, but there was something wrong about him. His eyes were wide, too wide, and his mouth hung open in a grin that wasn't his own. His teeth were sharper than they should be, his skin unnaturally taut. "Donnie?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. She stepped back, instinctively raising her hands as though to shield herself. "What's happening? Where's Nathaniel? Where are you? What's going on?" Donnie's head twitched, jerking to the side unnaturally. His smile stretched even wider. "It's here, Sarah. It's all here. The truth, the darkness, the deal, everything." His voice, though his lips didn't move, echoed in the empty space around her, like an ancient whisper reverberating through the air. "You called it. You asked for it. And now, you will pay." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. "No, no, this isn't real. This isn't happening." Donnie stepped forward, but with every movement, he seemed to distort, as though the air around him couldn't hold his form. Shadows crawled up his legs, dark tendrils twisting around his body like chains. The distortion grew stronger the closer he came, and the studio seemed to warp and bend in response to his presence. Then, he stopped. "You were always meant to be part of this, Sarah," Donnie said, his voice now dripping with malice. "You thought you were just telling stories. But the stories were never the point. You were the sacrifice." Before Sarah could react, Donnie's figure split in two. The half that remained standing still was grinning, but the other half, darker, more twisted, extended its hand, fingers reaching like claws toward her. Her mind screamed, but her body couldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare unfolding around her. A crackling noise filled the air as the distorted Donnie's fingers brushed against her cheek. The contact felt like fire and ice combined, and for a moment, her vision blurred. "Welcome to the final show, Sarah," the shadow Donnie hissed, its mouth stretching wider than humanly possible, revealing rows of teeth far too sharp. "You'll never leave. None of you will." Suddenly, the lights exploded into chaos, flickering and flashing in a strobe effect, blinding her. The studio filled with the sound of static, loud, deafening static that rattled her bones. And then, everything stopped. For one frozen moment, there was silence. Sarah opened her eyes, blinking rapidly to adjust to the darkness. Her surroundings had changed. She was no longer in the studio. She was standing in a vast, empty space, an endless void of black. There was no light, no sound, only the suffocating presence of something far older than time itself. "Sarah," a voice whispered again, this time soft and low, like the wind moving through the trees. "You're mine now." A figure materialized before her. It was tall and looming, its form shifting in the darkness like smoke. It didn't have a face, just a presence that filled the void around her, suffocating her with its very existence. "What do you want from me?" Sarah's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. The figure didn't speak, but the darkness around her began to press in. She felt herself falling, the ground beneath her vanishing as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. And then, she saw it. A glimpse of the studio. Donnie's face, twisted and unnatural. Nathaniel's eyes, wide with terror. The shadows of the cult, the ones who had summoned this nightmare. It was all connected. The show. The story. The people. And now, Sarah was a part of it. Forever. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward her. "You're just another piece of the game," it whispered, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Part 5, The Awakening. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as the blackness pressed in around her. She tried to scream, but the sound didn't leave her lips. It was as if the very air had become solid, suffocating her, trapping her in a cage of nothingness. She clawed at the void, trying to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they were no longer her own. The figure loomed before her, its form flickering like a broken reflection in water. It had no distinct features, no eyes, no face, just an overwhelming presence that made her feel small, insignificant. She could sense its hunger, its malice, but most of all, she could feel its anticipation. "You've awakened it, Sarah," the voice whispered again, the same soft and chilling breath from before. "You've brought us here. Who are you?" Sarah managed to whisper, her voice a mere tremor in the silence. "What do you want from me?" The figure did not answer, but Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet begin to shift, as though the void itself were unraveling, the pieces of reality falling away. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to stretch and ripple, and she saw the faintest flicker of the studio once more. The faces of the crew, the empty chairs, the cameras. But this time, the room was empty of life. There was no sound, no movement, only the oppressive weight of the darkness that had taken over. The figure in front of her reached out, its long, claw-like fingers stretching toward her, its touch colder than ice. "You are always part of this, Sarah," the voice purred. The show wasn't just for entertainment. It was a ritual. A ritual to break the veil and let us in. Suddenly, the air around her shifted. She felt herself falling, the sensation of weightlessness taking over, and then, with a sickening lurch, her feet hit the ground with a jolt. She gasped for air, her vision spinning as she staggered to her feet. She looked around, but she was no longer in the void. She was back in the studio, the lights flickering ominously overhead. But the studio was not as it once was. The walls were cracked, the air thick with the smell of decay. The monitors that had once shown the familiar broadcast now displayed static, flickering images that twisted and contorted. The cruise chairs were empty, the cameras abandoned, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. The only sound was the faint, low hum of something far deeper, far darker than any electrical equipment. And then, she saw it. The figure, the one she had glimpsed in the void, was standing in the middle of the studio. Its form was no longer a mere shadow, it was solid, tangible, its dark mass taking shape in front of her. It towered over her, its form twisting and shifting like liquid darkness. Its eyes, two blazing, fiery pits, glowed with an intensity that burned her soul. "You've seen us," the figure whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You've heard us. And now, you will never escape us." Sarah staggered back, her hands trembling as she reached for the nearest object, but everything was out of reach. The darkness seemed to crawl across the floor, creeping toward her, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She had no escape, no way out. And then, a voice, a familiar voice, cut through the suffocating silence. "Sarah!" She turned to see Nathaniel standing at the edge of the studio, his eyes wide and frantic, his body trembling as he reached out to her. He was alive, his skin pale, his face gaunt, but he was here. In front of her. "Nathaniel," Sarah gasped, relief flooding her chest for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "You're here, you're alive." Nathaniel shook his head frantically. "I'm not alive, Sarah. None of us are." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The figure in the center of the room let out a low, rumbling laugh, its voice like 1,000 whispers. "Nathaniel is right. None of you are alive. Not anymore." Sarah's heart sank as she turned back to the figure, feeling the weight of its words settle in her bones. "What is this? What do you want from us?" The figure's mouth stretched open impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "We are the ones who have been waiting. Waiting for you to call us. To bring us back." Suddenly, the air shifted again, and the studio around Sarah seemed to blur, twisting and warping like a bad dream. She saw flashes of the crew, their faces contorted in fear, their bodies frozen in place, caught in the same endless loop of darkness that had claimed them. The walls began to crack, the floor splintering beneath her feet. "Help me, Sarah!" Nathaniel cried, his voice desperate. "Don't let it take us." But it was too late. The figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet gave way. She screamed as she fell, the darkness swallowing her whole, pulling her into the abyss. Part 6: The Descent. Sarah's scream was swallowed by the void, her body plummeting into the endless darkness. She felt the sensation of falling forever, the world around her spinning into a disorienting blur. The ground was gone. The studio, the figure, Nathaniel, all of it vanished, consumed by the blackness that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of time and space. Her heart raced, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, but there was no air. No sound. Only the suffocating feeling of being lost in an eternal chasm. The world around her had twisted beyond recognition, and she realized, too late, that she was no longer in control. The darkness had taken over, and she was powerless to stop it. Then, with a sudden jolt, the falling stopped. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact reverberating through her spine. For a moment, there was nothing. Complete, oppressive silence. Her eyes fluttered open, and she slowly pushed herself up, her limbs aching from the fall. She tried to focus, but the air felt heavy, thick, as though it were suffused with something ancient, something evil. She was no longer in the studio. She wasn't anywhere familiar. The place she found herself in was vast and empty, like the belly of a cave that stretched out forever. The walls, if they could even be called that, were a sickly shade of gray, covered in veins of black, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The ground was slick, damp with an oily substance that clung to her shoes. There were no windows, no doors, no way to know where the end of this place lay. Just an infinite expanse of nothing. In the distance, she could hear whispers. They were faint at first, barely discernible, like the murmurs of 1,000 voices all speaking at once, just beyond her hearing. She could feel them pulling at her, tugging at her mind. She was being called. Sarah. The voice was familiar, twisted. You wanted to know the truth. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the figure again. It was standing at the far end of the cavernous space, its form as dark and formless as before, its presence a void in itself. "You," Sarah spat, her voice trembling with fury and fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure did not move. It simply stared, its fiery eyes glowing like molten embers. It did not speak at first. It didn't need to. "You've already given it to us," it said, its voice sending shivers down Sarah's spine. "You've awakened the truth. You opened the door. Now you must face what lies beyond it." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the very air around her was closing in. The figure began to step forward, and with each step it took, the ground beneath her feet trembled. She took a step back, trying to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The cavern stretched on forever in every direction, and she was trapped. "Please, just let me go," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be a part of this." The figure tilted its head, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. It was not a smile. It was something far darker, something that promised nothing but suffering. "You are already a part of it, Sarah. You always have been. This is your place. Your fate. Your story." As the figure advanced, the whispers grew louder, their words unintelligible but filled with a palpable hunger, a yearning for something terrible. Sarah's mind raced, her body frozen with fear. But she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. Then, from the corner of her eye, something shifted in the darkness. A figure emerged, stumbling, dragging itself toward her. At first, it was hard to make out who or what it was. But as it drew closer, Sarah's stomach lurched. It was Nathaniel. He looked worse than before. His skin was stretched tight, his eyes bloodshot, his body covered in a dark, writhing substance. He wasn't himself anymore. He was a puppet, a vessel for something far darker, something that had infected his very being. "Help me!" Nathaniel's voice cracked, his eyes filled with unspeakable horror. I didn't know what I was doing, but now it's too late." He reached out to Sarah, his hands trembling, but before she could reach him, the figure stepped in front of her, blocking her view. The darkness around them seemed to close in tighter, the whispers deafening now, a cacophony of voices. "You cannot save him, Sarah. There is no redemption here," the figure growled, its voice resonating in the very air itself. "He belongs to us, as you do now. You all belong to the void." The ground beneath Sarah's feet cracked open, and with it, the darkness surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. Nathaniel's scream was lost in the chaos, his body consumed by the shifting blackness. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. Sarah was standing alone in the cavernous space again, the silence almost suffocating in its intensity. Nathaniel was gone. The figure was gone. The whispers were silent. For a moment, she was left with nothing but her racing heart and the weight of what she had seen, what she had caused. The room felt endless, a prison with no exit. "It's not real," she told herself, but the words felt hollow. "This is a nightmare, and I'll wake up." But deep inside, she knew the truth. She wasn't waking up. This was real. And the darkness had claimed her. Part 7, The Devil's Bargain. Sarah stood motionless in the endless cavern, her body numb with fear, her mind a blur. The air, thick with the weight of ancient suffering, pressed in on her, suffocating her with its unseen hands. The whispers had returned, though now they seemed softer, as if they were circling just out of reach, teasing her with their promises of knowledge, of truth, but it was a truth she no longer wanted to know. The darkness was alive. She could feel it watching her, moving around her, tugging at her very essence. She had unwittingly become a part of it, an offering to whatever ancient force ruled this nightmare. You wanted to know, the voice echoed, now a guttural growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. Now you will learn what it means to awaken us. The figure appeared again, but this time it was not alone. Around it, the shadows of the crew, Jack, the others, stood, their bodies twisted, frozen in unnatural poses. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes empty of life, as though they were mere vessels for the malevolent force that had claimed them. "It's your fault, Sarah," Nathaniel's voice echoed from the darkness. "You brought us here. You gave it what it wanted." Her breath caught in her throat, guilt gnawing at her like a poison. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she thought, her mind spiraling into despair. "I was just telling a story. A show. Why did I have to go too far?" The figure stepped forward, its form shifting and distorting, becoming larger, more imposing. "You gave us the story, Sarah. And now we give you the truth. But the truth comes at a price." It raised one long, skeletal arm, and with a single, slow motion, pointed directly at her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air around her began to warp, twisting into shapes she couldn't comprehend. There was a sense of finality to it now, a point of no return. She was caught in the web, and there was no escape. "You belong to us now," the figure whispered, its voice deep and insistent, a promise of eternal darkness. Before she could speak, the shadows surged forward, surrounding her. She tried to scream, to fight back, but it was no use. The darkness enveloped her, pulling her into its cold embrace, and as the world around her shattered into oblivion, she understood. This wasn't a nightmare. It was her new reality. Part 8. The Truth Unfolds. Sarah's world shattered into 1,000 pieces as the darkness consumed her, wrapping its cold tendrils around her mind and soul. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think. It was as though the very essence of her being was being ripped apart, torn from her and woven into something far older, far darker than any reality she had ever known. Her heart raced, and she could feel the panic rising, clawing at her throat. The darkness around her churned, a swirling mass of shadows and whispers, each one a fragment of a forgotten past, a promise of something worse to come. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she collapsed to the ground, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had no idea where she was. The space she was in now felt like a twisted version of reality, something both familiar and alien at the same time. The studio lights were gone. The equipment, the crew, the set, everything had disappeared, replaced by a cavernous space that seemed to stretch on forever, like a gaping maw of darkness waiting to swallow her whole. And in the center of it all stood the figure, that horrible, monstrous thing that had claimed the souls of those around her. Its eyes glowed with an infernal light, its form writhing and shifting, never quite staying still. You're still here?" Sarah whispered, barely able to find the strength to speak. The figure did not respond immediately. Instead, It moved closer, its movements unnatural and fluid, like it was made of shadows and nightmares. It bent down toward her, its presence pressing against her, smothering her. She could feel it reaching into her chest, into her very soul, pulling at something deep inside her. It was as though it was searching for something, something it had been waiting for. You thought you could escape, the voice rumbled, its tone deep and ancient, but you never could. Terror coursed through her veins as she realized the truth. She was no longer the same. The darkness had left its mark on her. It had changed her. You're not real, Sarah said, trying to hold onto her sanity, trying to fight the overwhelming sense of doom creeping up on her. This is just a dream. It's not real. The figure chuckled, its laughter sending a chill down her spine. You wanted the truth, Sarah. You wanted to uncover the darkness. And now, you will see it for what it truly is. The world around her shifted again, the shadows swirling violently, the space twisting and distorting. It felt like the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. Her surroundings no longer made sense, no longer followed any kind of logic. She was no longer in a studio, no longer in any familiar place. She was in the belly of something ancient, something vast, a place outside of time, outside of the universe as she knew it. Look around you, Sarah, the figure commanded. See what you have brought forth. See what your curiosity has awakened. Sarah's vision blurred, but through the haze, she saw it, the truth, twisted and horrifying. The walls of the cavern were alive, pulsing with a grotesque energy, like the heartbeat of some forgotten god. She could see the faces of the crew, Jack, Nathaniel, each one distorted, their eyes empty, their bodies frozen in unnatural postures. They were no longer human. They were part of something darker, something far more terrifying than she had imagined. They were lost, trapped in the very darkness she had unwittingly summoned. Nathaniel's face was the worst of all. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at her with a hollow emptiness that chilled her to the bone. He was no longer the man she had met. He was a vessel, a pawn in a game far beyond her comprehension. This is what I've done? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its mouth stretching into a grin that seemed to widen endlessly. You did not need to know, Sarah. The truth has always been with you. It is in the air you breathe, in the stories you tell. You cannot escape it. You never could. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The shadows rose, swirling in a violent storm, and the voices, those maddening whispers, returned, louder now, their words a jumble of fragmented thoughts, of twisted pleas for mercy. Help us! One voice cried, a familiar voice. It was Jack. We didn't mean it. We were just doing our jobs. Another voice joined in, desperate and hollow. It was Donnie. We were supposed to entertain, to keep the show going. It wasn't supposed to be real. We didn't know. Please, Sarah. But Sarah could barely hear them, for the sound of the growing storm of shadows drowned out everything else. The voices of the crew grew louder, but their words were lost in the cacophony. The figure towered over her, its shape shifting, growing larger, its presence so overwhelming it seemed to warp the very air around them. You see, Sarah, the figure said, its voice low and filled with malevolence. You have learned the truth, and now you will live with it. The stories, the rituals, They were never meant to entertain. They were meant to summon us. To bring us here. To claim you all. No, Sarah gasped, backing away, trying to escape, but the shadows pressed in, forcing her forward. There was nowhere to run. I didn't know. I didn't want this. The figure's laughter filled the cavern, a terrible sound that echoed in her bones. It matters not, Sarah. You were always part of the game. And now, the game has changed. As the shadows enveloped her once more, she felt herself being pulled deeper into the abyss. Her body felt weightless, as though she were no longer in control of it. The ground disappeared beneath her, and once again, she was falling. But this time, there was no screaming. No panic. Just a quiet acceptance as the darkness swallowed her whole. And in the distance, through the swirling chaos, she saw something, a light. A faint glimmer, like a beacon in the distance. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the air, but it was too far away. The shadows held her tight, refusing to let go. She was caught in their grip, and the light faded, leaving nothing but darkness. As she was pulled deeper into the void, she realized with chilling clarity that there was no escape from this place. No way out. No way to undo the damage she had done. She was trapped. And so were they all. Part 9, The Lost Ones. The darkness was absolute. It consumed everything, Sarah, the crew, the studio, the stories they had told. There was no escape, no relief. The silence was deafening, stretching out for what felt like an eternity. But in that silence, Sarah began to hear something, a voice. Faint at first, like the distant murmur of a memory. Sarah. Sarah. The voice was familiar, but distorted, barely audible through the suffocating quiet. It was as if the voice itself was lost in the void, unable to reach her fully. Is someone there? Sarah called, her voice trembling with the remnants of fear that still clung to her. She tried to move, to shift out of the stillness, but her body remained as heavy as the darkness around her. She couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything but the cold emptiness. And then, the voice came again, louder this time, clearer. Sarah. It was Nathaniel's voice. But it was different now, broken, twisted, like it was coming from far away, distorted by the space between them. And in that distortion, Sarah felt something shift deep within her. Something primal. Something ancient. Nathaniel, she whispered, her heart skipping a beat. Where are you? The voice responded, but it was no longer just Nathaniel's. It was joined by other voices, some familiar, some not. The crew, the others who had been a part of this twisted reality. Jack. Donnie. Sarah couldn't make sense of the words. They were too many, too jumbled, overlapping with each other, as if the voices were tangled in a never-ending scream. Please, help us. Jack's voice trembled. We didn't know, we didn't understand what we were doing. We thought it was just a show. Please, you have to stop it. Stop what? Sarah cried out, her mind racing. What's happening? What's going on? The darkness seemed to respond, growing heavier, pressing against her chest, tightening around her until it felt as though she was being crushed by an invisible weight. Sarah. Nathaniel's voice again. It was weak, broken, as though the person who had once been Nathaniel was fading. You have to understand, this is the price. The price for opening the door. We're all trapped now. All of us. We can never go back. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to comprehend what he was saying. What door? What are you talking about? You were part of this too, Nathaniel. We all were. Not like this, he replied, his voice fading in and out, like a whisper on the wind. Not like this. It was always supposed to end differently. But the door is closed now, Sarah. There's no way back. We're stuck here. Forever. The space around her pulsed, the weight of the words settling in. She could feel it now, the terrible truth, like a weight pressing on her soul. The door, whatever it had been, was no longer just a metaphor. It was real. The darkness was real. And whatever had come through it was here to stay. Sarah's mind reeled. She had been drawn into this, like all the others. A part of something far bigger than herself. The cult, the ritual, the stories, everything had been leading up to this moment. She had unwittingly called it into being, opened the door to something ancient and unspeakable. She had played her part in the ritual, and now the price had to be paid. The voices of the lost crew members whispered louder, almost frantic now, their words tumbling over each other in an incoherent rush. We're here, trapped, part of it. Donnie's voice broke through. You have to help us. We can't escape. It won't let us go. I can't help you. Sarah screamed, her voice breaking as her mind shattered under the weight of her helplessness. I can't fix this. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't. You never knew, the figure interrupted, its voice now a low, resonating growl that vibrated through Sarah's very core. It was there again, looming in the shadows, its presence omnipresent, suffocating. None of you knew. But now, you do. Sarah's heart raced as she turned toward the source of the voice. The figure loomed before her once more, its eyes glowing brighter than ever before, a fiery blaze that burned through the void. It stood tall, an embodiment of darkness, something beyond comprehension. Its form shifted, stretching and contorting in ways that made her stomach churn. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a being, it was the embodiment of the void itself. You've awakened something, it continued, its voice dripping with malice, and now it belongs to you. Your curiosity, your foolishness, it all led here. The stories were never meant to entertain. They were always meant to call us. What are you? Sarah demanded, stepping back, her body trembling with terror. What do you want from me? The figure laughed, a hollow, cold sound that echoed through the cavern. We want what is ours. What has always been ours. You will serve us, just like the others. Forever. Suddenly, the air around Sarah thickened, swirling with an unnatural force. The space around her seemed to contract, the shadows closing in, pushing her toward the center of the void. She felt herself being pulled in, a magnetic force drawing her closer and closer to the figure. You belong to us now, Sarah, it whispered, its voice like the wind, carrying a promise of endless torment. There is no escape. No redemption. You are one of us. You have always been one of us. Sarah's breath quickened as she felt herself slipping into the darkness, her vision blurring as the figure's presence overwhelmed her. She tried to scream, to fight back, but her body refused to obey. Her mind was slipping away, consumed by the void, as the truth she had uncovered, the terrible truth, took root inside her. The last thing she heard before the darkness took over was the voice of the figure, repeating one final sentence, its words sealing her fate. You are ours. Part 10, the end of the show. The silence was absolute. Sarah couldn't hear her own breath, couldn't feel the beating of her heart. Time itself had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness that surrounded her. She was weightless, floating in an eternal void, with no sense of direction, no point of reference. The world she had known, the studio, the people, had all faded into nothingness, like an old memory that had been erased from existence. She had given everything to the darkness. Her curiosity, her desire to uncover the truth, had led her to this very moment. She had opened the door. And now, she was trapped. Her mind was unraveling, the last shreds of her sanity being consumed by the void. The voices of the lost crew members, Jack, Donnie, Nathaniel, had faded into a low, constant hum, an eternal echo of their suffering. But there was one voice that remained. One voice that cut through the silence like a knife. It was the figure. Welcome, the figure's voice said, its words reverberating through Sarah's very soul. You are finally one with us. Finally free from the shackles of your old world. You are no longer bound by time or space. You are now eternal. The figure's presence filled the void, its form looming over Sarah like a shadow that covered everything in sight. Its eyes burned like the embers of a dying fire, glowing with an intensity that threatened to consume her completely. There is no escape, Sarah, the figure continued, its voice deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder. You have become part of the story, part of the ritual. And now, the story will never end. Sarah's mind was in turmoil. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on her, suffocating her. But there was something else, a glimmer of defiance, a flicker of resistance deep within her. She had given herself to the darkness, yes. She had opened the door, yes. But that didn't mean she had to accept it. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, this isn't right. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the infinite void. It does not matter what you wanted, Sarah. What matters now is what you have become. Sarah closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of the crew, Jack, Donnie, Nathaniel, trapped in this same nightmare. They had been part of the ritual too. And now, they were all lost. But perhaps there was something she could do. Some way to reverse the ritual. To stop the darkness from spreading. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden change in the atmosphere. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, and the voices of the crew grew louder, more frantic. They were no longer whispering. They were crying out in desperation. Help us, Sarah! Donnie's voice cried, his tone filled with agony. You have to end it. You have to stop it. Sarah's heart ached. She didn't know how. She didn't know what to do. But she knew one thing. She couldn't just give in. She couldn't accept this fate. The figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. It is too late, it whispered. The ritual is complete. You are ours. All of you. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She focused on the voices, on the desperate cries of her friends, her crew. She reached deep within herself, pulling on every ounce of strength she had left. There had to be a way to fight back. She refused to let this be the end. And then, as if by instinct, she understood. The truth wasn't in the darkness. It was in the stories. The stories had always been the key. The stories were what had called the darkness into being. But the stories could also be what banished it. She had to rewrite the ending. She had to tell the story her way. Taking a deep breath, Sarah spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "This is where the story ends," she said, her words echoing in the void. The door closes. The darkness fades. The show is over. For a moment, everything went still. The air, the voices, the shadows, all of it paused, as if waiting for something. And then, with a sound like the crack of a whip, the darkness recoiled. The figure screamed, its form shifting and distorting as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The ground beneath Sarah's feet began to rumble, the void splintering, cracking, like a fragile glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. "This isn't your story anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice steady now. "This is my story. And it ends here." With a final, earth-shattering roar, the figure was pulled into the collapsing void, its form dissolving into nothingness. The darkness that had once consumed everything was now retreating, unraveling like the last strands of a dying dream. And then, there was nothing. Silence. Slowly, Sarah opened her eyes. The darkness was gone. The oppressive weight had lifted. She was back. Back in the studio, in the place where it had all started. The cameras were still, the lights dim, but the air was clear. The crew, Jack, Donnie, Nathaniel, were gone. The only thing left was her. The show was over. She stood there for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The terror, the darkness, the figures, they were all gone. But there was no joy in her victory. There was no triumph. Just the hollow emptiness of a story that had ended, but one that would never truly be forgotten. She had stopped the ritual. She had closed the door. But the darkness would always be there, waiting for the next person to open it. And Sarah knew that, deep down, this was just the beginning. The end. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.